Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And that was a perfect timing for that, because I was just going to say I'll be sharing my slides with you afterward as well. I have a lot of information and data that I provide in these presentations and try to give a pretty high level overview, but there's a lot of things that you might want to dig in on after. So I like to provide those with some of the links and resources that I use, so you can continue discovering and building your own future of work. So just very quickly, as Michael said, the office itself was established through an executive order from Governor Polis in September of 2019. And I have two really broad mandates. One is to raise awareness about what the future of work looks like, and presentations like this, and then also to identify policy and program solutions. And so at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the specific projects that we're taking on as those have evolved over the last couple of years. But primarily what I work on is, conducting new and applying existing research into our workforce development and education systems, doing convenings, listening sessions, and ultimately a summit around the future of work, holding working groups on specific topics that are impacting the future of work, and then of course participating in aligned efforts across the state. So things, for example, like a lot of the recovery dollars that were given to Colorado from the federal administration, trying to apply a future of work lens to how CDLE implemented those. And so what we're working towards is a future where all Coloradans can access meaningful and sustainable employment. So I'll circle back to the office, but for the bulk of this presentation, just want to sort of arm you with context and information about the future of work and what that really looks like. And so, as Michael said, our definition of the future of work is really around it's a holistic definition to try to just really capture all of these forces that are shaping the work we do and how we do it. So that includes globalization, market forces, demographic shifts, technological advances. So it's not one thing. Future of work is a quite buzzwordy term. So when you hear it, you might think, oh, gig workers, or robots and automation, or some other topic that comes to mind. And so we really wanted to take that holistic approach and consider the variety of forces that are shaping work, and also to really sort of myth bust the idea that the future of work is in the future. These are trends that have been at work for a long time and continue to be at work. And so if you were at the presentation last year, you'll see some of the same slides. And what I've tried to do is also provide some of the updated information about the COVID impact and new research that's emerged over the last year since I last spoke with you all. So I'll go through each of these forces, and then we'll talk about sort of the path forward and what the Office of the Future of Work does. If you want to interrupt me or put questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. I don't mind at all, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end as well. So globalization is generally used to describe just the increasing internationalization of markets for goods, services, means of production, supply chains, you name it. So overall, since 2001, DHL has actually put together this global connectedness score. That's a cumulative score based on a few components of globalization. So it includes international trade, capital, information, and people. So thinking about the interplay of those across the world. And what they've seen is since 2001, with occasional dips, there's been a growing trend towards globalization. So our economy, our world is increasingly global, and that impacts the work that's available and the work that we do. At the same time, you also have market forces, which is just a term to refer to the general shifts in supply, demand, trade, government priorities, and those things that impact the economy from that perspective. And so what we've seen is, over the last 40 years, both globalization and market forces have really created a ton of opportunity for some workers, for some industries and some geographies, while they've also put a significant amount of pressure on others. And apologies if some of the graphs are small or the data points are small or harder to read. I'll talk through each of them, and again, encourage you to sort of dive in and look at some of the data in more detail that interests you. So this graph is just reflecting the idea that I just shared around globalization and the increasing internationalization of markets. So we've seen that on this graph, what it's talking about is outsourcing. So really more the flow of people or the exchange of goods and services. And so we've seen that for the most part, we've had an increasing trend towards outsourcing and global worker chains since the 1980s. And primarily these jobs have been focused in manufacturing, customer support, and related functions. Similar to my annual report, the DHL Global Connectedness Score appears or is published in December of each year. And so we have the update from 2021. And so what we do see is that globalization is on track to go back to pre-pandemic levels in 2022. And prior to some of the earlier predictions, we haven't seen a large shift to more regional approaches. It seems like we're still having an increased globalization trend, even despite the pandemic and the impact on some of those supply chains. Though of course there are examples and smaller pockets as well. And so that, again, very high level overview of globalization, but just showing the interconnectedness of markets and how information, goods, people have continued to flow, though of course with the people flows halting for a bit during the pandemic. And I'll get back to some of the impacts that this has had on wages at a later section, because there's been new research that's talked a little bit more about that. One of the other trends we've seen is related to more of the market forces. So over the last few decades, companies have faced increased pressure to improve, more of that short-term financial performance for public and private investors. And so this has resulted in a shift in company culture and company priorities and at a large scale. It's a phenomenon that's called the fissured workplace, if you've heard that term. But essentially it refers to the fact that many businesses, large enterprises, have been shifting over the last few decades from focusing on a wider variety of activities out to focusing on core competencies and outsourcing less essential activities to third parties, whether that is outsourcing, as we talked about with globalization, whether it's partnering with a third party to hire independent contractors, whether it's hiring consultants to take on certain aspects of the job, or even thinking about temporary staffing agencies. So early on when this trend began, the essential activity, the less essential activities that sort of got outsourced or moved to other companies, they included things like accounting, human resources, but more and more we're seeing businesses use this practice and including activities that you primarily might have thought would be part of sort of core business activities. So you see things from anything from like strategic planning, where consultants are often brought in to do that. You have janitorial and facilities maintenance and security that is most often provided by a third party and not by a core employer. And so while some of these activities, again, have allowed for more profits for companies, we've also seen that it puts pressure on the sort of lowest wage worker. And so this is one of the sort of contributing factors to just the proliferation of low wage work over the last few decades. This analysis from Brookings is one I refer back to a lot. They looked at, in 2017, prior to the pandemic, how wages had changed from 1979 to 2016. And so then they tried to look at, based on geographies, the percentage of people who were working in a low wage job. And so they considered those low wage workers on a regional sense. So it wasn't just, a blanket, if you're making less than X, you're a low wage worker, but it takes into account some of the regional disparities in terms of cost of living. And what they found was that 53 million workers in the US were working in a low wage job. And you see in Boulder, I pulled the data from this analysis in 2017, and you see over 40% of the workforce was working in a low wage job. And so prior to the pandemic, we, in Colorado had record low unemployment rates, had, by all accounts, a very booming economy. But we see that success was not felt by significant portions of our labor market. And as we'll see in the slides coming up, the low wage workers were most impacted by the pandemic as well. We find that 40% of low wage workers receive safety net assistance. So, cost to our system, that they're majority younger populations and primarily Hispanic or Latino populations. So this low wage workforce makes up a huge chunk of what we see in our economy and a huge part of the challenges we see moving forward. One thing that's particularly concerning from my perspective about just the growth of the low wage workforce, the outsized impact of the pandemic on low wage workers, as well as sort of the path forward, we hear a lot in terms of recovery about transitioning individuals into higher paying work. Another analysis from the Brookings Future of Work initiative looked at the path that low wage workers take and some of the feasible pathways that are present for workers to transition from these low wage jobs into higher wage work. Most notably, I think from this analysis, we saw that the longer someone is in a low wage job, the harder it is for them to emerge out of that low wage job. So for every 4 years that you have a low wage job, your likelihood of leaving a low wage profession decreases by half. And by your 10th year, the chances of you reaching a higher paying job are only about 1%. And so in addition to that, many of these pathways from low wage to high wage jobs are expected to disappear as we have more people competing for these higher paying pathways. And so as we think about recovery from the pandemic and the health of our economy, considering how we transition people from low wage to higher wage jobs is a really significant task, but also a really imperative task if we're trying to really create opportunity and reduce the number of people working in low wage jobs. So this was all true before the pandemic, and as I've alluded to already throughout the presentation, and I think many of us are aware, the pandemic had a really outsized impact on low wage workers. They were more likely to be in professions that were sort of on the front lines and experienced closures and ongoing openings and closures and inconsistent scheduling. And so this report from Track the Recovery has been tracking employment levels for different wage groups across the country. And you can look at it by states, which is what this report is showing, to see employment levels throughout the pandemic. And we see that for low wage workers and workers of all kinds, that there's just significant gaps in terms of employment levels from pre-pandemic levels. And so as we move out of the immediate crisis and go into this more, I won't say stable, but this new iteration with the variants that keep appearing, low wage workers continue to suffer quite a bit. And so as we look to recovery, thinking about how we really target those individuals that were in low wage jobs, are currently unemployed, and connect them to these more sustainable pathways is a real big focus. The other thing I'll mention too that will come up as part of the technological advances section is the idea that, we want fewer low wage jobs in our economy. It's better for us if more people are earning a living wage. And there are significant jobs, there are many jobs that can benefit from technology reducing the amount of human labor that's needed. So one example is a proposal actually from the Colorado Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging, where they proposed looking at, for example, direct care workers in nursing homes and think about how technology can alleviate some of the pressure on those workers and reduce the number of workers that are needed to provide quality service. So that is a bit about market forces. One thing I did just want to mention too, in case this comes up from your perspective or you've seen this, is just the growth of the gig economy or the on-demand workforce. This was a savior for many during the pandemic who, maybe were in jobs where their business is closed, and if they were able to take on gig work, it allowed them to have some sustainable income. But there's also a lot of questions about how technology is used in the workplace, how we protect workers who are participating in this work, and also how we preserve flexibility. And so for the first time, the Colorado Department of Revenue in December published data about the gig economy from what they can gather from tax records. And so on the left, you have a representation of the increase in just the number of people who are self-employed and participating in, the gig economy. And on the right, they tried to isolate it by those that are participating in what are called transportation network companies or delivery network companies, so Lyft, Uber, DoorDash. And so we see that on the left, you have, as of 2018, up about 342,000 Coloradans that filed 1099-Ks or MISCs reflecting, self-employment and gig work. And then on the right, you have for TNCs and DNCs, in 2018, it was down to about 19,000 workers. So it's a significant portion of our workforce. One of the other reports that was published about this that was interesting to me was a national survey from the Pew Research Center to gauge the experience of these workers and also the perception of this work from those who hadn't participated. Based on their nationwide survey, they found that 16% of US adults have earned money through an online gig platform. And that in total, from their survey, 9% were currently working as gig workers. And so this just, again, emphasizes the point that this is a significant part of our labor force, of our economy. And it's part of what we need to think through as we consider, the pathways for people who are looking to move from full-time gig employment to more traditional pathways, how we value the skills people have from gig work and from self-employment, and also how we, pair, again, the worker protections and benefits for these emerging ways of working. All right. Let me pause and look at the questions before I move on to technological advances. David, I'll talk a little bit about broadband and just the digital inequities across the state as part of a section later. And then I work very closely with our Office of Just Transition, focusing on transition from coal economy. So I'll touch base on that too. And I was excited to hear you were part of the Alliance Centers group because I have been keeping tabs and working with Brenna a bit, and I'm hoping to get more involved. So it'll be nice to see you there. Okay, so that was a very high level 101 globalization market forces, and I don't pretend to say it's comprehensive, but just some of the key highlights that are impacting the work available and what we've seen over the last 40 years. What I want to move to now are these demographic shifts, because as we think about the future of work, it's also the future of workers and who makes up our workforce in the state. And so what we've seen is, Colorado, much like the US, is aging and diversifying. So we've seen that the 65 plus age group in Colorado has had the highest aggregate population growth, increasing by nearly 41% from 2010 to 2019. I should have said this before I started, but one of the exciting things from my presentation last year to this year is that, of course, we have results from the census. So we have a lot better sense of what our population change looks like and what our population looks like across Colorado. So we've seen this significant growth of our 65 plus population. We also see that if we combine that growth with the relatively slow growth incline in population projected for 2025 to 2050, we see that there's going to be significant pressures on our labor market and true worker shortages. And so I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides, but the growth of our 65 plus population is a part of that. We've also seen that the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on our older workers who were more likely to be laid off early on in the pandemic and often face longer times of unemployment, which the longer you're unemployed, the harder it is to reconnect with employment. And in particular, based on some of the analysis we've seen, is that mid-career women ages 40 to 65 across the US, about 40% of them have experienced at least one job interruption. And of those who were still unemployed, 70% were out of work for 6 months or more. And so we also see that across age groups, but in particular too for older women, that many individuals cited, childcare needs for either a child or grandchild as a significant factor preventing them from participating fully in the labor market. And so one thing, if you guys have seen, I'll drop it in the chat after I'm done blabbering at you, but there's a report from the Stanford Center on Longevity that talks about the need to build an economy for a 60-year work life, because newer generations are just more and more likely to live to 100 years old. And so a 60-year work life is really what will take place over the next few decades. And so instead of saying everyone needs to work full-time 40 hours a week for 60 years, how do we adjust our systems and create sort of those on-ramps, off-ramps to training and work, create flexibility and policies that support a glide path to retirement, and ultimately maximize the skills and economic impact of older workers.
Katherine?
Carol, I see you have raised a hand, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, part of my question is, all this is good, and I understand, and I am in some of those ranges that you're talking about. And one thing I'd like to know is, how are we going to get companies to buy into this? Okay, it's like, if you look out there right now, companies like it, I won't mention any names, but some companies have extremely lengthy job recs. Like, no one person could do it, okay? And they're not offering a pay that is equal to that. So I don't know if this is your area. This may be the wrong question to ask you. How are we going to get companies to understand that, hey, if you want somebody to do the work of two people, you got to pay them more?
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and that is the work that we are tackling now. And I think one of the silver linings of this worker shortage and the declining birth rate and the demographic drought that I'll talk about in a second is that employers have to shift their practices to remain competitive. And so one of the big projects that we promote at CDLE and are working on with employers and is a priority of Governor Polis is the idea of skills-based hiring, where we're shifting hiring from the demand for bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, when they are not necessary, but rather to reflect the specific skills needed for a job. So that's one of the pieces in the sort of culture shifts that we're promoting. I also think it'll just be part of the pressure. Some of these culture shifts will happen because of the pressure that employers feel now to find the talent they need. We've seen how policies and wages are changing as a result of this near-term pressure, which is only going to get worse. So what we're working on is to help employers shift their practices and think differently about how they hire, how they create flexibility, and ultimately how they create a worker-friendly environment. And then I think we also just have to think about the realities of age discrimination and biases that are impacting hiring quality talent when there's no difference in skills. And in many cases, some of the skills that when we see age discrimination take place around, digital natives or what have you, are really not the reality for the workers that are applying for these jobs. Yeah, Brian?
I just had one comment. I mean, I'm emotionally impacted by this in the sense that I'm not really a competitive type personality. And I'm trying to make that transition into those better jobs. And I feel like just trying to, gauge the transition into just the UX design arena and trying to sift through how I relate to being that low income arena. That's where I've been. Even I have a graduate degree, and I don't think even degrees necessarily mean that you'll get out of it. And so I'm here like kind of emotionally impacted, and I feel like, oh, geez.
Yeah, I mean, it's powerful data that is really, I hope, is a wake up call for many. And I hope at the very least, what you're seeing in the data is sort of validating your experience and helping you see that it's not a reflection of your skills, your worth, your ability to do any of these things. It's the impact of all of these forces and this culture that is in the process of shifting, and it's shifting too slowly. And I hope that we are on the horizon or that this culture shift taking place is really on the horizon, and we're at the beginning stages of that. So I appreciate you sharing that, and yeah, I hope it's just sort of that validation that I think in our economy, it's often, and in US culture, it's often put on the individual when there's so many forces outside of our control that are shaping our experience and our day-to-day. So with that, I talked a bit about the aging workforce and how that's shaping our economy. One thing that the census showed us as well is that, our population is diversifying quite a bit. So we see for the first time in the US, as a result of the data from the census, that children of color now comprise more than half of the nation's total youth population. In Colorado in particular, the population under the age of 18 is more diverse than older Coloradans, and we're seeing that expected to grow quite a bit. This is not a very fun slide to look at, but it's just talking, because I pulled it directly from the census results and from our demographies office, but it's just showing over the last 10 years, the population change by racial demographics in our state. And so we see that overall our population grew by 14.8%, and that our racial and ethnic minorities will soon become our majorities, but that they're growing at a different rate and a faster rate than our white populations. And so some of the data we talked about before, where we see how younger individuals and in particular Latino populations were making up the majority of the low-wage workforce and the majority of people impacted by COVID. We have real systemic barriers to shift so that this growing segment of our workforce can actually find economic opportunity in Colorado as it continues to evolve. One of the other things that was really interesting from the census data was around how rural America is shifting. So, I think many of the assumptions around rural America are that it's very white and not diverse. And what we're seeing is, though it is still majority white, that there's been significant growth in diverse populations moving to rural communities. And so across the US, the population of color is increasing by 3.5% across rural counties. And in Colorado, Latinos make up the largest non-white groups in every county, rural or metro, except for Montezuma County, so where American Indians are the largest non-white group. And so this is, of course, the national look at it. And then I wanted to pull from the demographer's office. This is the percent of population that is Latino, identifies as Latino or Hispanic across Colorado counties. And so you see in our southern areas and across many rural counties that the percentage of population that is Latino or Hispanic is significant. And so as we look at that, we see that our policies, our assumptions, and just the way we think about rural America needs to shift, and we need to embrace intentional strategies to nurture this diversity and to create opportunities for individuals that are moving to these communities. And that's a lot of the work of just transition, thinking about resilient economic development, and really nurturing and strengthening social cohesion between neighbors, community-led infrastructure and structures to build capacity, and ultimately to just build really strong neighbors and communities as part of our economic development strategies moving forward. So that's a bit how the demographics have shifted across Colorado and the US, with the two takeaways being we have a diverse younger population that's continuing to face those systemic barriers that we've designed, that have been in place and that have been designed in there, that we're working to dismantle, as well as the same systemic barriers that face older workers who are making up a large part of our workforce and our population. At the same time as all of these are happening, we have a looming worker shortage. This analysis from EMSI-MZ, a labor market firm, was probably the most intense one I read in preparation for my annual report and as part of the research over the last year, because we hear a lot about worker shortage right now, and when in fact I think many of those shortages are a result of sort of employers not shifting their practices to really understand the skills they might need, and some more of a mismatch. But what we have over the next few decades is what's expected to be a deficit of 6 million workers as a result of baby boomers leaving the workforce at faster rates, younger generations that are participating in the workforce at a lower rate, especially after the pandemic for certain segments of our population, and then declining birth rates. And so we see a real talent shortage that is going to require intentional long-term strategies. And we can learn from Japan, we can learn from Germany, Singapore, other countries who have faced this labor shortage in a real way to think differently about how we design. So in addition to the here and now, we have this worker shortage that really requires our attention. Okay, then I want to get into technological transformation. So let me just check in on the chat real quick. All right. So I'll address some of those at the end too, if around affordable housing and those pieces. So when you hear future of work, I think most people think about technological advances. So we've seen over the last 40 years how technology has transformed work and how it continues to. And just like every other trend, it creates opportunity for some, and it also puts pressure on different segments of our population. In particular, I focus on information around automation, artificial intelligence, and digitalization. Obviously, these are not all of the technologies that exist, but these are some of the larger groups of technology that are impacting the work we do and how we do it. So automation is the use of technology to reduce the level of human activity needed to complete a particular task. It most often is used to augment labor and does not often eliminate entire jobs. It also more often impacts so-called blue-collar jobs, and I'll talk about that in a second. Artificial intelligence is computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. And so this technology can often displace some workers, and it seems to have more of an impact on more white collar jobs, you know, accountants, finance, and some of these other, so-called white collar jobs. And then digitalization, I would say, is, you know, it's the use of digital tools to accomplish certain tasks, to move work forward. And so we've seen it in the workplace. You know, I think virtual presentations like this are a great example. We've seen it in our day-to-day lives, whether that's ordering groceries or using apps for social media or traffic or other directions or anything like that. But it's just the increased use of digital tools to move work or act forward, to move work forward or to accomplish tasks. And so new research over the last year has shown, you know, of course, people are looking at previous pandemics to see what has happened as a result of, to the economy as a result of other pandemics. And we see that based on the data from other pandemics, that robot adoption increases after pandemic events, especially when the health impact is severe and is associated with significant economic downturn. And so we've seen increased adoption of robots and AI as a result of the pandemic. And in many cases, robots that reflect sort of automation are often impacting lower wage workers. But even when those are the disruptions that take place, you have ripple effects across all income brackets because people, again, more people are competing for the same jobs. What we see is that as a result of the pandemic, AI adoption is increasing, automation adoption is increasing. So McKinsey & Company they do an annual state of AI, and in their 2021 survey of over 1,800 employers across the world, across industries, across company sizes, they found that 56% of all respondents reported that AI adoption that they have adopted AI for at least one function of their business. And so that's up from 50% in 2020. So a 6% increase in that year. And so as a result of this increased adoption, we're seeing that there'll likely be a labor shortfall between 1% and 4.4% by 2030. And so again, as we think about worker shortages, as we think of the challenges facing employers and finding the talent they need, the technological advances are going to continue to impact that. So we see in particular that worker deficits would be expected in computer and mathematics, healthcare practitioners in some of their support capacities, and then educational instruction in the library sector, which I'll talk about in a second. And then, so that's AI. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about automation and how it often, it has played a role in the economy and in displacement over the last 40 years. So what we see is that automation is more likely to displace tasks that are routine and non-cognitive. So you have those definitions on the right here. You know, often the sort of routine manual, I guess I should say, not non-cognitive, but you see the production, transportation, and material moving occupations are often those that are impacted by automation. And we've seen this reflected in job postings that are asking for more non-routine cognitive tasks, while the demand for routine cognitive, routine manual, and non-routine manual have either declined or stagnated over the last few years. This is a hard to read slide, but it just depicts sort of the impact of automation, the potential impact of automation by various industries. So I'll talk through it real quick. But what we see again is that automation is more likely to impact those industries and those jobs where there are more routine manual tasks. This analysis was looking at a task level analysis of occupations within industries to see, based on where automation was at that point, 2017, how many occupations would it impact? How many tasks would it impact? So on the far left, you have 73% of tasks within accommodation and food services could be done by technology. That doesn't mean they are or that automation is adopted. It just is more a reflection of the type of tasks that make up those occupations. You have that followed by manufacturing, transportation on the left. On the far right, you have educational services, where 27% of the tasks in educational services could be done by technology, followed by professional, scientific, and technical services, IT, healthcare, management. So even on the far right, you have about a quarter to a third of tasks that technology could do. And so as we think about proliferation of low-wage work, in particular in many of these industries that are critical, like healthcare, like education, as well as sort of the need for people to shift into higher paying jobs, I think there's potential to explore how technology can reduce the number of people who are needed in these riskier jobs that depend more on those routine non-cognitive tasks or manual tasks to create space for the more meaningful aspects and human aspects of work. And so as we move forward, I'll talk about sort of the skills and mindsets that are needed to move forward and be successful and future ready and agile. But I think it's also on us at the state level, at the employer level, to think about how we use technology differently to improve job quality. One of the things that we've seen, and if you paid really good attention last year to my presentation, you would have seen that this slide was after globalization, when in fact new research is showing how automation and technological advances have played a larger role in decreasing wages than globalization has. Globalization has impacted it, just not to the extent that automation and technology has. So what we see is, since 1979 to 2018, workers without a college degree have experienced significant wage declines, which is part of that proliferation of low-wage work. And as we talked about, by no means are we suggesting with this slide that, oh, well, everyone needs a bachelor's degree and then we're good. The reality is that a lot of this disruption is impacting those individuals who are unable to access high-wage work and are only really considered for jobs that have been most impacted by these disruptions. And so as we are working to shift to a skills-based economy that values the wide variety of skills people get from work, from life, and outside of four-year and master's degrees, then we'll be tapping into talent that can absolutely thrive and support business in the new economy. But because of this sort of dependence on a bachelor's degree as a entry point or a proxy for other skills, we've seen segments of our population really marginalized and only have access to certain jobs that face all of this disruption. And so moving forward, as we shift to the skills-based economy, we're thinking a lot about how we value skills people have, and the Department of Higher Ed, to their credit, is working quite a bit on things like the prior learning assessment, where you can get credit towards a degree for work experience, and the Office of Economic Development and CDLE are working to shift the hiring practices for employers so that they see the huge amount of talent available to them. All right, so with that, we talked about artificial intelligence, automation, and the impact on work. What we've also seen, of course, is digitalization of work and the increased demand for digital skills. As of 2019, 8 in 10 jobs that did not require a bachelor's degree asked for digital skills, and more industries are requiring digital skills. So in the past, you might have only needed higher levels of digital skills for digitally specific or tech-specific industries. More and more across all industries, digital skills are required. So this graph on the left is just showing the increased demand for higher levels of digital skills. And on the right, what we see is how the digitalization of the workplace and of employment across Colorado cities and communities has really changed. We see more and more jobs depending on that digital skill set. And while this is probably something we all knew, that digital skills are very in demand, what we may have assumptions about is who has those digital skills. Across demographic groups, across industries, across age groups, we see that there are significant gaps in the number of people who have digital skills. And while you may assume that digital native younger populations may be better at using technology, what they often lack is this the concept of digital resilience, where because I know how to use Snapchat or TikTok, I can now use other technology in the workplace. We don't see that translation happening. And so even if you grew up with technology, your ability to use that to solve problems in the workplace varies by age group. And so this analysis, which you might remember if you saw the presentation last year, was looking at the percentage of workers in various industries who lacked digital skills. So in construction, you had up to 50% who had limited or no digital skills. Retail, 37%. Education at the bottom, 15%. That's a significant segment of our workforce. There's a huge number of people who we have failed in terms of building the skills that they need to be successful. And so those who don't have those digital skills are really at risk of falling behind as work continues to evolve. One of the other shifts we've seen is, that transition to remote work, and remote work creating more opportunities for people to work across county, state, country lines. And yet many of these jobs are not, the transition to remote work was only really experienced by a segment of our population, more of the medium and high paying jobs. And as we consider how we support people in accessing remote work, building digital skills to connect to these opportunities is paramount. I know this is another small graph on the left, but what you'll see is in the presentation is McKinsey did an analysis of, depending on the types of tasks of a job, the likelihood that it could be done remotely or the percentage that could be done remotely. And so you see, financial, management, professional services have more tasks that could be done remotely. But again, you sort of see across the board, there's some tasks that can be done remotely. And so as we think about, flexibility and creating work environments that benefit workers, thinking about that, that shift will be part of this. So in addition to digital skills gaps, we also have huge digital inequities across the state that I think David mentioned in the chat earlier. So we have large portions of our population that don't have access to affordable high-speed internet. And while many of that is in rural communities, we also, there's the concept of digital redlining, where in metro areas we see where there hasn't been the infrastructure built to support high-speed internet in our poorer communities and those that are more likely for people of color to live in. So in metro areas, they may only have copper wire for a DSL, and they can't support high-speed internet. So that's impacting people's ability to build new skills, compete in the new digital economy, and also just to participate in daily life as it moves more online. People lack access to smartphones, laptops in their homes. And so as we're promoting and seeing the trends towards digital work, we have to address this digital divide and really support access to affordable internet, which I work on with the Colorado Broadband Office. They are facilitating investments to build out more broadband infrastructure with local communities. And I focus on how we build digital skills and access to devices so that we have adoption of the internet where it is available. All right, that was all, the context again for where we are, what the economy looks like today. And what I want to sort of end on is the skills, mindsets, and supports that are needed for the future of work. One thing we know is that skills and jobs are changing rapidly all the time. This is just a screenshot from a LinkedIn Future of Skills tool that they have that I can drop in the chat, where they were looking at how many jobs, how skills for jobs have changed over the last 6 years. And so they found across occupations, across the world, that skills needed for an occupation changed by an average of 25% over the last 6 years. So that's accelerated because of, you know, technological advances and because of COVID in a lot of ways. But it just points to the fact that we have to be learning all the time, and skills are shifting quite a bit. And I am mindful that, you know, this puts a lot of pressure on workers. And this is what we are sharing with employers too, that they also need to think differently about how they hire, the skills they're asking for, and get specific about what they're demanding. And so we see that in order to be resilient, looking at data from past pandemics, looking at resumes and careers for millions of workers who have weathered economic disruption, we see that there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that there's a need for every worker to have a combination of skills and mindsets. Human skills, those things that make us uniquely human, the communication, collaboration, critical thinking, empathy, all of those things that make us human are incredibly important. In combination with that, we have digital building blocks, the ability to use data and digital tools to move work forward and to solve problems. And then finally, business enablers, which is the ability to take those skill sets and technical skill sets to for the occupation we're in at hand. And so we see that the most resilient workers facing disruption are what MZ termed T-shaped workers, where they have general skill sets across these important categories: human skills, digital building blocks, and business enablers. And then they have depth of knowledge for that specific occupation. And so that is something that I think I am certainly thinking about quite a bit as I think about my own career, is how do I make sure I have the foundational skills needed for any job, but then I can dive deep based on my job today, you know, policy, research, thinking about the economy. How do I build that depth of knowledge to remain competitive in my current occupation, but keep that breadth of knowledge to remain competitive in transitioning? If you don't like circles and you prefer pyramids, this is the other way of looking at it from McKinsey, where they talk about AQ, EQ, and IQ. So adaptability, that lifelong learning, growth mindset; EQ, those uniquely human skills; and then IQ, the digital building blocks and technical skills and knowledge. So what we've been doing is trying to support sort of the understanding of what does it mean to be digitally literate, what digital skills are in demand. And so we have a beta digital skills catalog. And I say beta because it's literally, you know, a spreadsheet where we were looking at job postings from the last year, as well as 10 reports around the future of work and what digital skills will be in demand. And so we found around 244 unique digital skills or competencies that are part of work, learning, or daily life. Some of them are foundational, and some of them are more cutting edge that would, if you're interested in diving deeper, could make you, you know, sort of stand out if you have that skill set. So I'll drop a link to that, but again, that caveat that it is very much beta mode, and we are looking for feedback on that, and also want to turn that into information for training providers and others to use to build out resources. And lastly, I just want to talk about the fact that this shift and building an ecosystem for digital resilience, as Digital Us names it, really requires everyone being at the table. To build a learner and worker-centric economy, we need employers to step up to make sure that they are reducing, not contributing to the digital divide, that they're hiring based on skills, that they're creating policies and environments that support workers. We need to make sure that government is responsive and shifting based on the research and the data we have, and redesigning how we deliver services. As technology continues to grow, tech developers need to keep that learner and worker at the center of it. And then education and service providers have to shift what they're doing to be more responsive to the realities of our economy and the wide varieties of demographics and age groups that will be needing to upskill, reskill at all times. And so as we move forward, we're trying to convene and create interventions with all of these different partners so that we have real opportunity for individuals to succeed. One of the really powerful quotes, I think, from the demographic drought report is just talking about that there is not a single person that can be wasted in our economy, given how the birth rate's declining, how we have this real worker shortage looming. And so the call to action for us as the government, as employers, is to make sure that we're retaining workers and building systems where they can be successful, because we can't waste a single person's skill set in the economy of the future. So with that, I have sort of my guiding questions just around, how do we make sure we have fewer low-wage jobs in the economy and create real transitions to better pathways? How do we support technological adoption, especially in smaller and medium-sized businesses where human touch is less critical or where the work is unsafe? How do we make sure we invest in coaching and programs like the ones Heather leads to make sure people have the guidance and the information they need to make their next step? How do we redesign training? And how do we shift the culture of employers to hire differently? And then how do we close the digital divide so that everyone can access opportunity? And so the Office of Future Work has, again, a pretty broad mandate. We have basically 3 areas of exploration that shapes the work we take on. So one is around modern worker protections and benefits. That's primarily focused on gig workers in my first couple of years. The second is around transformation planning for all. So thinking about how do we support individuals, employers, and communities and as part of this transformation we're all experiencing. And that's where I work closely with Department of Local Affairs and the Colorado Resiliency Office to support the resiliency framework. And that's my main connection to the affordable housing conversations that they lead. And then how do we design for historically excluded populations, whether that's older workers who are often disregarded in the labor market, and then our diverse younger populations. So with that, I lead our state apprenticeship agency. We believe in work-based learning and apprenticeship as a key equity strategy to connect people to opportunity. So we promote registered apprenticeships that allow people to earn while they learn. And then I also lead the state's digital equity and literacy work. And then my other projects are sort of a smaller nature, but those are sort of my major initiatives, which you can check out on my website. I talked for way more than 45 minutes, Michael. I was so wrong, but I did try to slow down versus last year, but that's what I have.
I'd say that was perfect because you started at about 9:22 and you're finishing up approximately 9:22, so an hour. That's great. So we'll have ample time for questions and answers. So I thought that was a super